In August of 2014, I had the privilege of being invited to attend the James Lawson Institute up in Nashville. James Lawson was the foremost strategist working in the civil rights movement from 1958 to 1968. He worked under the leadership of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who called him, quote, the mind of the movement. You've probably seen Lawson in historical footage or fictional portrayals of the students preparing to sit in at lunch counters, where they would practice the difficult and dangerous scenarios they were going to encounter. He was the one organizing the practices, encouraging the students to be hard on each other, knowing that what they were going to face in the process of ending segregation was severe hatred and violence. There is maybe no one alive better situated to place our current struggles for social justice in a historical context, although after yesterday I should say maybe no one alive outside of Georgia's 5th Congressional District. Thank you, John Lewis. So proud to have voted for you multiple times for Congress. And so I was excited, given Reverend Lawson's capacity for putting our struggle in a historical context. I was very eager to learn from him. A couple of his messages stood out to me in particular. Someone asked Reverend Lawson during the Institute why movements for social change today seem to be stalling, seem to be much slower or less successful than civil rights movements of the 60s. Was it that we lacked the charismatic leadership from that previous era? Had the tactics of that movement lost their efficacy due to oppositional adaptation or societal indifference since then? His response was that ending segregation and explicit prejudice and discrimination, to the extent that they had been successful, represented the low-hanging fruit in our quest for a more just and equitable nation. He said that dramatizing the injustices of segregation and explicit prejudice, while not easy things to do, had had clearer roadmaps to success than the issues facing the movement today, which one might broadly categorize as institutional racism. The effects of institutional racism are in their own ways just as harmful as segregation and prejudice, but are much harder to dramatize and therefore to fight against. He said that we are engaged in a much longer and more difficult stage of the fight for justice and equity that will require high degrees of patience, analysis, and collaboration. We'll need our places to stand in the milky water, as we heard about in the reading this morning, so that we can be the mice with a psychological basis for optimism. I hope that UUCA can be one of those places for folks to stand. The other thing he said that has stuck with me was one day on the way to lunch, I was talking with him about being a Unitarian Universalist minister in Atlanta. He asked about our membership, and I said that for at least the last decade, we've hovered about 700 people, sometimes a little higher or lower, and recently a little under that number. We're at about 650 members right now. Right as I finished describing our situation, we got to the dining hall, and he stopped. He leaned on his cane, and he looked at me. He said, I know Atlanta, and I know Unitarianism. You all are very much what that city needs right now. You should be growing there. Wow. So you don't have to take my word for it when it comes to needing our congregation strong. Our civil rights elders see this need and hope that we will fulfill it also. They want us to be a source of optimism amidst the rat race. Folks, we need our congregation strong. On the surface, we need our congregation strong might be the least controversial sermon title I've ever preached. especially given that in the last couple years I have spoken in favor of slavery reparations, preparing for the singularity, and running barefoot on public roads and streets. But fear not, for even within the statement, we need our congregation strong. I intend to find some potential areas of disagreement and address them directly. And no, I don't mean that I'm going to ask whether us being strong means that we should start lacing our fair trade coffee with performance-enhancing drugs. That's not the kind of strength that we should be talking about. First off, I want to ask who we mean when we say we and our. Who are we as a congregation? As described above, our identity is very much tied to some of the proudest moments in our history, which mostly happened over 50 years ago now during the Civil Rights Movement. We seem to have spent much of the time since then asking how we can continue to make our presence felt in the world, asking what's next for us as a congregation and as a movement that would help shape the world around us. I agree with Reverend Lawson that it is completely natural and sensible for our goals to be less clear and the way forward more difficult to discern than during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. I say this as a longtime student of that era, albeit with only second and third-hand knowledge of it, and as someone with contemporary activist experience in the anti-Iraq War, Occupy, and Allies for Racial Equity movements. Mustering the high degrees of patience, analysis, and collaboration necessary for this work now are challenging things to do and are precisely why religious communities are some of the best places from which to operate as agents of social change. In addition to the question of who are we, I feel we are called to ask, whose are we? To whom does our community belong, and to whom are we accountable? With whom are we in the kinds of relationships that can lead to collaborative efforts for the change needed in our world, the way that Farley Wheelwright's relationship with MLK led him to be one of the first ministers to go to Selma? This question has been thrown into stark relief recently as we consider whether or not to potentially sell our building and move the physical location of the congregation. In asking this question of whose are we, I'd like to lift up those who are not currently voting members of our congregation, but who will be affected by the decision of whether or not to sell this property. In particular, it is worth noting that because Article 5, Section 1, Item A of our bylaws states that you must be at least 14 years old to be a member of UUCA, we as a congregation are called to make this decision in a way that is accountable to those who are currently children and to unborn future generations. What decision will best serve them? Let's make sure that is part of the conversation that we're having. Furthermore, we have a stated commitment to the work of anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism, the acronym ARAMAC we use as shorthand for this work. Who does that commitment make us accountable to? What decision will put us in the best position to truly continue to grow as a multicultural institution? The decision facing us is a hard one, but it is also an opportunity to ask the kinds of questions that will help us to be more fully in relationship in the ways necessary for us to act missionally for social change. And what does it mean for our congregation to be strong? I believe that it means that we are a source of optimism, like the stand in the milky water that helped some participants in the rat race to keep going longer than they would have otherwise because they were optimistic, because they had hope. I get discouraged in this work sometimes, and I need our congregation strong to convince me it is important to keep going, to keep swimming. I know many of you do too. Us being strong means that we lift each other up, support each other, treat each other with respect and dignity, and model the world that we want to see, remembering the African proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. We need this to be a place where we can practice living into Dr. King's commandment that we must all learn to live together as siblings, or we will all perish together as fools. The work before us is more opaque than it was when we were younger as a movement and as a community. But we know that when the water is opaque, that is when it's most important to remember our successes, our sources of confidence, the ways that we have been successful in this work in the past. We have been successful working for a more just and equitable world, and if we can keep swimming, then there are successes yet to come in living into that vision. Peace, salam, shalom, and may it be so.